Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Dania Rajendra, the director of the Athena Coalition. We are more than 50 organizations across the United States, representing millions of people who feel the pernicious power of big tech over their lives every day, as workers, as neighbors, and in particular, as Black and brown working people in our democracy, our economy, and our environment. Athena is here today with the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition and American Family Voices. We are all so encouraged to see such strong findings and recommendations in yesterday's historic report from the House Judiciary Committee's Antitrust Subcommittee. The report and the investigation leading up to it is a watershed moment. For years, working people have been saying that big tech has accumulated too much power and that companies like Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Google are using that power in abusive ways. This report is a vindication for every courageous person who has told the truth, countering the spin of these powerful corporations. It affirms that the abuses are stacking up, from the so-called Facebook jail for Black activists, to the dangerous working conditions inside Amazon's operations, to the misinformation flooding Facebook and other social media platforms, to the bullying of community businesses and public officials, to the vacuuming up of data that fuels racial profiling and criminalization and policing of our Black, brown, and immigrant neighbors. We know that addressing these abuses is fundamental to fixing our democracy. This report is an amazing first step, and it has been a bipartisan effort since the start, reflecting the fact that concerns about the power of big tech are shared across our wide political spectrum. Congress can and should lead on addressing the needed repairs to our democracy and our economy. To talk about the report and its significance, we're joined by the committee's chairman, Representative David Cicilline, as well as organizers, an Amazon worker, and owner of a small business, advocates, and policy experts. Thank you all. Welcome, Chairman Cicilline. Thank you so much for your leadership throughout this investigation and in this report. Congressman, we would love to hear your thoughts at this historic moment.
Thank you, and thank you to the Athena Coalition for your great partnership and for the many members of your coalition who have been thinking about and writing and speaking out about this very serious challenge for a long time. As I said at the beginning of this investigation, we promised to do a kind of top to bottom review of the state of competition in the digital marketplace. And, as we conclude this investigation and issue the report yesterday was about 15 months long, I think it's very clear from our findings that our investigation confirms that the digital economy has become highly concentrated and prone to monopolization, and these large platforms clearly have monopoly power and are engaged in very anti-competitive behaviors. I would say that kind of the three major takeaways are that Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google each now serves as a gatekeeper over a key channel of distribution. By controlling access to markets, these giants can pick winners and losers throughout our economy. They not only wield tremendous power, but they also abuse it by charging exorbitant fees, imposing oppressive contracts, and extracting valuable data from the people and businesses that they rely on. The second key finding is that each platform uses its gatekeeper position to protect its own power. By controlling the infrastructure of the digital age, they have surveilled other businesses to identify potential rivals and ultimately bought out, copied, or cut off their competitive threats. And third, these platforms abuse their control to expand their own power, whether it's through self-preferencing, predatory pricing, or requiring users to buy additional products. The dominant platforms have used their power in destructive ways in order to grow even bigger and maintain their market dominance. And so, there are obviously very detailed factual findings, but I think those are kind of the three key findings of the investigation. We then set forth a menu of options to consider in terms of responding to these challenges. I would group those also into three buckets. The first is restoring competition in the digital economy, and ways to do that and to really achieve that goal include things like structural separations and prohibitions of certain dominant platforms from operating in adjacent lines of business. This is the so-called sort of Glass-Steagall of the internet. prohibiting platforms from engaging in self-preferencing, discriminatory actions, or favoritism in their business models, and requiring platforms to make their services compatible with various networks and to make content and information easily portable between them. And so the notions of data portability and interoperability. So that's restoring competition in the digital economy. The second area is strengthening existing antitrust laws, recommendations regarding updating Section 7 of the Clayton Act, including through restoring presumption and bright line rules, restoring the incipient standard, and protecting nascent competitors and strengthening laws on vertical mergers. And so there's a significant amount of work that we can do in that space. We also make recommendations about updating Section 2 of the Sherman Act, including by introducing a prohibition on abusive dominance and clarifying prohibitions on monopoly, leveraging, predatory pricing, denial of essential facilities, refusal to deal, tying, and anti-competitive self-preferencing and product design. So there's a number of things that we can do, I think, specifically in Section 2. And then, finally, to sort of take some additional measures to strengthen overall enforcement, including, and this is a very serious issue, overriding some very problematic precedents in the case law in which courts have significantly narrowed the ability of antitrust enforcers to do their work. It's led to a kind of sense of like, why try? This is going to be so hard to meet this burden. And these are court decisions really very often kind of spun out of whole cloth that really undermine the true intent of good competition policy or the intent of Congress. So reversing some of those, I think, is a key reform. And then the third area is reviving antitrust enforcement broadly. And that includes civil penalties and other relief for unfair methods of competition rules, requiring the FTC to engage in regular data collection on concentration, and requiring regular merger retrospectives, as well as some additional support for private enforcement. And I think, in this space of reviving antitrust enforcement, there's a recognition, again, that we need to fund our antitrust agencies so they have the ability to actually do what we expect of them, but they also need to be staffed and led by people with, sufficient enthusiasm and creativity to take this work seriously and to use all the tools that are available, and hopefully some new tools that we will give them to vigorously enforce competition policy. So those are kind of the three main areas. In terms of what's next, my expectation is that we will mark up the report when we return. And I expect that to be done in a bipartisan way. And then we will begin, and in fact, we've already begun some drafting of legislation that responds specifically to the recommendations that are made in the report.
So exciting. Thank you very much. We'll move now to the rest of our panel. First up, we have Mike Massey, owner of Massey's Professional Outfitters in New Orleans. Mike?
Hey, it's good to meet you guys. My name is Mike Massey. I am a small specialty retailer based in New Orleans. And, I guess my role here today is I was one of the very first sporting good retailers, if not the first sporting good retailers, to participate in the Amazon Marketplace platform going back to the early 2000s. I found that the marketplace was, going to be a successful addition to my business. I felt strongly that not only myself, but my peers in the retail space and also my brands would become partners in selling on the Amazon platform. And I was fairly successful at selling on the Amazon platform for a few years in the early and mid 2000s. By the latter part of the 2000s, what I was discovering was that Amazon was openly hostile to my business. They were increasingly trying to frustrate my relationship with customers. They were probing my inventory information, and they were sidestepping me to go directly to my brands to create, scenarios where, they could eliminate competition and start selling the products that we brought onto the platform for themselves directly. We found that to be extremely disruptive. And beyond that, when we tried to reconcile some of the various customer service or business relationship aspects with Amazon, we found them hostile to even the concept of doing anything at all that would help us, become a better seller on the platform. After a somewhat of a period of time, by the 2010 period, I started looking for an exit, and as I began working towards an exit, I was being told by people throughout the supply chain that Amazon was either trying to disrupt their business as a supplier, a wholesale manufacturer, an original equipment manufacturer. They were actively seeking to cash in on their presence and use their position to bully all of our suppliers. And by 2011 or 12, I decided to pull completely off of the Amazon platform. It took me till 2013 to get completely off. But I'm excited by what you guys are just doing here. I think that that no one should hold the type of presence that Amazon does over the entire retail supply chain. And I look forward to seeing what comes out of this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Mike. Next, we have Will Stoltz, who works at Amazon. Will works at a fulfillment center in Shakopee, Minnesota, and has been a longtime leader with the Awood Center, an Athena member. Will?
Yes, William Stoltz. I've been working at Amazon's warehouse outside of the Twin Cities in Minnesota for just over 3 years. Been a part of different worker organizing there, trying to improve the working conditions. And I think the main way that Amazon's monopoly power affects like our just trying to get fair treatment on the job is that they seem to think that they're so powerful that they can just mistreat workers with almost impunity. Amazon's injury rate is something that really surprised me, shocked me when I started there. It's far outsized compared to other companies in the same like warehousing sector. And I'm so glad finally some of the data is coming out on that through Reveal and the Center for Investigative Reporting. Also, as it relates to coronavirus, they were acting as if they were not accountable to anybody because they were so powerful. There were very few whether like parts of the government or workers who could, really get them to commit to do things that we needed, like, closing down the warehouses when the virus started spreading, which workers demanded. And now in Minnesota, based on Amazon's data that just came out, Minnesota had one of the highest infection rates out of all of Amazon's warehouses. And that was something that we had been saying to them for months, trying to get them to do more. They have like a huge amount of resources to try to invest into trying to stop workers from organizing. And the monopolization, just to bring it back to injuries for a second and just working there. So I think the way that the monopolization has affected my life most directly is that working in that warehouse, I have to wear this wrist brace on both of my hands every day, just so I don't have pain doing this job. And the only place I can find one, I was able to find this exact brace that gives me enough support for my hands, was actually on Amazon through one of those sellers. And so it's like, as workers, we're just kind of stuck. They have so much power to fight back against us in the fight for better working conditions. And it's concerning to me to see them spreading, to see their kind of business model spreading to other businesses who either are imitating them to be able to compete, or or are forced into a position to be more ruthless to its people just to survive. And so I really hope there's some, I was glad to see this report come out, and I hope that Congress can make a good effort in the future.
Thank you very much, William. Now we'll go to Rashad Robinson, President of Color of Change, who has been leading the charge about Facebook.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone on this call. And I want to first acknowledge the progress that this report represents, the work of the Congressman and his colleagues to shed a light on all of the ways in which big tech is hurting our communities. This antitrust report confirms what Color of Change and our allies have been warning for years. Big tech companies like Amazon and Facebook have grown too powerful. Left unregulated, companies like Facebook will continue to use their power in ways that threaten our democracy, Black people's lives, and the well-being of our communities. The stakes online, in the voting booth, and on our streets are too high and require serious intervention. Color of Change has engaged with Facebook since 2015 on issues stemming from its unchecked power, including its repeated failures to stop the proliferation of hate and misinformation on its platform, its monopolistic governance structure, and its lack of attention to equity and representation among its senior leadership. The antitrust report hammers home what we have known, that users do not have other meaningful choices other than Facebook. Between September 2017 and September 2018, Facebook reached 75% of all internet users in the United States. Facebook is this fundamental to our online lives, and we must hold it accountable and make it healthier. In the absence of self-regulation by Facebook and without intervention from lawmakers and regulatory agencies, advertisers and everyday people who have joined advocacy groups to take action, we will not get change. As one of the leaders of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, we recognize the unprecedented public examination that we provided on Facebook and its policies. But with over 1,000 major advertisers divesting from Facebook, and with major organizations also holding them accountable in civil rights groups, and Facebook still didn't feel the pressure to make any real changes and stated that publicly. That, my friends, is why we are calling them a monopoly. That is why we are talking about their unchecked power. Facebook has over 2.6 billion users. That is more followers than Christianity. One person should not control a company that big, have 60% of the shares, and be chairperson and CEO, and they should not continue to be able to buy up all of their competitors. The technology that has so much potential to bring us into the future shouldn't continue to drag us into a past where we were threatened in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of settings for who we are. Civil rights is absolutely at stake as we think about the role of these companies. And civil rights also needs to be at the center of how we solve these problems. Racial justice needs to be at the heart of how we work to change things, not just fighting racism, but racial justice as a force multiplier, to force these companies to do the right thing, to bring more people to the table, and to implement the policies and the practices that are going to allow all of our voices to flourish online, offline, in our democracy, and in the marketplace. Thank you to everyone who is working hard to do this work, and we stand ready to work with Congress and whoever else to implement the type of changes that our communities need and deserve.
Thank you so very much, Rashad. Next, we'll go to David Segal. David is the Executive Director of Demand Progress, an Athena member, and is co-chair of the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition. David?
Thank you. So this report is an affirmation of and a push forward in a consolidation of a critique of the market, of the power of these companies that's been years in the making now. The report and the investigation that led to it represent a watershed in the critique of the power of the major online platforms, which we can now say is blessed by a critical organ of the Congress. And also these concerns are becoming consensus among Democrats and have also achieved substantial traction among Republicans. Fundamentally, as the report puts it, companies that were once scrappy, underdog startups that challenged the status quo have become the kinds of monopolies we last saw in the era of oil barons and railroad tycoons. And not only does this report ratify these concerns, but it announces that something can and needs to be done to address them in the regulatory and enforcement and legislative spheres. Companies that have for too long sought to be seen as sitting outside of the realm of democratic control, or in Facebook's case, which have essentially declared themselves to be quasi-governments, must be made to contend with the rule of law. This report and the growing consensus that it endorses have emerged despite, or perhaps substantially because of, a long history of non-interest and non-enforcement by relevant authorities a lack of legislative action by Congress and FTC and DOJ that under Democrats and Republicans have waved through hundreds of acquisitions by the companies in question, including major anti-competitive mergers like Facebook's acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, and Amazon's purchase of Whole Foods, and Google's purchases of Waze and DoubleClick, and just to name a handful of many. But it's now clear the landscape has shifted, and we hope that this report will be a wake-up call to regulators and enforcers and other members of Congress. It will also serve to push back against, for instance, Google's public relations efforts to preemptively disparage as partisan or political an antitrust lawsuit, or perhaps a series of them that might soon emerge from the DOJ and various states' attorneys general. So make no mistake about it, this report underscores the validity of such investigations and makes clear the bipartisan nature of support for addressing the concerns they seek to interrogate. And it's clear that moving forward, we can expect relevant actors to be objects of increased scrutiny and organizing by the coalitions and organizations that are represented here on this call and by others, which together have already taken scores of meetings with policymakers and organized hundreds of thousands of grassroots contacts to lawmakers and confront the power of big tech. So this report is tremendous because it represents an affirmation of years of work by so many and also provides a roadmap for what must happen over the months and years to come. And we at Demand Progress and at Freedom from Facebook and Google and in Athena and so many others are committed to continuing to push down that path.
Thank you, David. Tremendous indeed. Now we'll move to Sally Hubbard, Director of Enforcement Strategy at Open Markets Institute, a leading think tank on the harms of monopoly power. We're running on time. We'll have Chairman Cicilline with us for another 20 minutes, so please begin to put your questions in the chat if you're a member of the media.
So I want to start by saying that this was a phenomenal, historic report, and I want to thank Chairman Cicilline, the subcommittee, and the committee staff for their incredibly hard work. Big tech and their legions of mouthpieces are already trying to present the recommendations in the report as radical, but they're not. These are all tried and true policies that have been implemented successfully in America's past. What's radical is the pro-monopoly policy of the last 30 years, which has created a planned economy based on highly concentrated economic and political power. Now, the report talks a lot about network effects. Network effects arise when the value that a user derives from a product increases based on the number of other people who use it. But there's nothing new about network effects. They've existed in industries like railroads and telecom, and so we can use the same tools that we've always used to prevent private actors from using such essential networks to manipulate and exploit individual citizens and businesses. Now, the report just calls on these standard regulatory tools. They include structural separation, and which is the standard regulatory tool and antitrust remedy in networked industries. We've used structural separations before to remove conflicts of interest, and we don't tolerate those conflicts in other sectors like banking. Interoperability was also a remedy that was used to open up competition in AT&T and US v. Microsoft. And non-discrimination is, again, a standard regulatory tool. It goes way back to the Interstate Commerce Act. It's part of the net neutrality order that the FCC is currently dismantling. But it's also used for essential patents that must be licensed on fair and reasonable terms. So these are all standard tools. There's nothing radical about them at all. And repealing the bad cases of recent decades in antitrust law will also just bring us back to where we were before the antitrust laws got gutted. Big tech is going to attack these reforms as bad for innovation, but strong antitrust enforcement creates new waves of innovation, like when the government broke up AT&T, and when US v. Microsoft paved the way for Google to exist by stopping Microsoft from taking over every market that touched its monopoly. So again, there's nothing radical or scary about the reforms that are proposed, but what is scary are the tens of millions of dollars that big tech will unleash to defeat these reforms that we so desperately need. So the only thing that can defeat that monopoly money is the people. And that's why the grassroots work of the Athena Coalition is so important. And that's why I wrote a book on monopolies suck, because I want to make everybody understand monopolies. This cannot be an issue that only antitrust lawyers and economists are allowed to talk about and understand. So I just want to finish by saying that representatives like Cicilline, Chairman Cicilline, who are courageous enough to stand up to monopoly power, need a movement of people supporting them. And that's the role that I hope this coalition can play. And I'm really excited about the fight that we have ahead of us.
Thank you, Sally. Next up, Alex Harman from Public Citizen. You're the competition policy advocate. Tell us what we need to know as Amazon customers.
Thank you. Public Citizen is a nonprofit research, litigation, and consumer advocacy organization, and we also co-chair a coalition of organizations seeking to reform the very badly broken antitrust system. Chairman Cicilline and the staff and members of the Antitrust Subcommittee have achieved something historic and momentous with this investigation and report. The report confirms what we've always believed: big tech's abuse of power is a threat to democracy, workers, and consumers. As these companies have grown, they've also spent tens of millions of dollars on to grow their influence in Washington, and this has helped maintain their power without oversight or accountability from the federal government. That unbridled power ends with this report. We've all grown to rely on the products and services these companies sell us. The companies have abused their power, stifle innovation, lock out competitors, and ultimately provide consumers with fewer choices and worse quality and greater costs. Apple and Google have a total monopoly on their respective app stores. iPhone and Android users cannot download apps from other sources and end up paying the price for an anti-competitive business model that incentivizes higher fees or intrusive advertising. Facebook, with Instagram and WhatsApp, has a clear social networking monopoly. Consumers are stuck with services that not only provide little privacy protection, but make their money selling personal data to hostile actors, such as Cambridge Analytica. While many were angered by that scandal, Facebook has paid little to no price. In fact, it has only since increased its size and reach. This is because consumers have no other viable options to connect with their friends, message, and share photos. One last example, Public Citizen recently published a report I authored that demonstrates how Amazon has continued to gouge prices throughout the COVID pandemic. Amazon's monopoly on online retail has allowed it to keep prices up on essential goods like toilet paper, hand soap, and baking flour, taking advantage of consumers at their most vulnerable. Consumers suffer when there is no competition. These are just some of the examples of how consumers are harmed by these four companies' abuse of monopoly power. While we can observe how consumers have been harmed, we do not know what innovations consumers lost out on because of big tech's power abuses. Investors in Silicon Valley won't put money into ideas that might compete with these companies. In many cases, the companies buy potential rivals to prevent them from becoming potential competitors. All of these actions have cost consumers potential benefits: more choice, better quality, and lower prices. It is a myth that these tech companies are innovators. These are mature monopolists who strategically seek to maintain their dominant positions at the expense of consumers, workers, innovators, and democracy. Chairman Cicilline's report and the reforms it recommends are necessary to stop these abusive and dangerous companies from growing even more powerful. We look forward to the opportunity to continue to work with the committee and our partners to bring about these reforms as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Our next to last speaker is Cendejas, who helped lead organizing against Amazon in and around Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia as an organizer with LaColectiVA and a member of Athena's national leadership team. Dani.
Good afternoon. First off, I want to thank all the community members that have been organizing to break up the power of monopolies and recognize Representative Cicilline and the subcommittee for a powerful investigation and standing up to Amazon. I'm Dani Cendejas, co-founder and organizer of LaColectiVA, a community group that organizes with the Latinx community in Northern Virginia. When Amazon announced it was putting its HQ2 in our neighborhood, we got together with our allies in the DMV and started the coalition For Us Not Amazon with the support of Athena. At For Us Not Amazon, we all focus on different things: environmental justice, racial justice, housing rights, education, but we have all come together because we can already see how our health and our neighborhoods are in danger of being sold out to make way for Amazon. This is the power that Amazon has. All of us can remember how metros all across the country bent over backwards to get Amazon to pick them for HQ2. It was truly a joke how much they were willing to sell their residents out through tax breaks and incentives. People living around Amazon facilities have had their air and water become toxic. They've seen racist surveillance and over-policing increase. They've seen their local leaders bow to Amazon at the expense of affordable housing and their children's schools. All of us have seen our beloved community businesses put up against the ropes and disappear. The challenges that are happening here in the DMV have played out in so many other places, from the Midwest to Seattle to California and onto the Deep South. Despite this though, we have already made some gains. Here in our area, we shifted the narrative around the proposed HQ2 from simply a quote unquote jobs plan to shedding light on the impacts this development will have on Black and brown communities in our region. Our community organized to push back against the proposed agreement between Arlington County Police and Amazon Ring, and we won. And we kicked off demands to claw back the $800 million in incentives Amazon could receive from Virginia and Arlington County, so that those funds can be available for public needs during and following this pandemic. It takes a constant collective effort in all our communities for residents to push back against Amazon's impact, but we know we can't do it alone. We need elected officials to have our back. That's why this investigation is so important, and it's why Congress needs to take the next step. This can't just end with the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. So inspiring. Sarah Miller is Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. She'll be wrapping us up and managing Q&A. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dania. I think we only have the Congressman's time for a little bit longer, so we have quite a few questions in the chat. I just want to dive right in and then we'll wrap up. Congressman, I want to share this question from Cecilia Kong at the New York Times. She asks, which company comes closest to clearly breaking antitrust laws in your opinion? And then I'll also include her follow-up question, which is, have you and your staff discussed proposals with the Biden team? And can you share any context on that relationship and dynamic?
Yeah, I would say, each of the companies that were the subject of this study of the digital marketplace engage in different behavior, which is anti-competitive and which involves the kind of use of their monopoly power in ways that undermine competition. But I would say that the two that where there's really clear evidence of monopoly power and the abuse of that power are Google and Facebook, for sure. And obviously Amazon has, monopoly power over sellers and vendors. So, I've now answered with 3 out of the 4, but.
All of the above is a great answer.
All of the above, yeah. I mean, the report details, it's different behaviors, but all again, using their market dominance in ways that undermine competition and act as gatekeepers and, sustaining their market dominance.
Thanks so much. Do you want to say any words about how you expect this report to land in a 2021 context if the White House changes hands? And, we really kind of see this as the flagship set of recommendations for the Democratic Party. And obviously you managed to earn some meaningful bipartisan cooperation as well.
Yeah.
That.
Well, I think, look, I think there's no question that Vice President Biden understands these issues. He has spent his life dedicated to fighting on behalf of working families and small business and understands that this economic concentration of economic power is harmful to consumers and small business and workers and reduces innovation and choice and degrades quality. So I think he has spoken, not necessarily in antitrust terms, but about the consequences of this kind of market dominance or this concentration of economic power and what it means in the daily lives of the American people. So I expect that a Biden administration will be very receptive to a set of reforms that would bring real competition back into the digital marketplace and help create opportunities for new innovation, new entrepreneurs, more choices for consumers, better treatment of workers, and better quality of consumer goods. So I think we'll have a very receptive year in a Biden administration. And I hope that's what happens in November so we can move forward with the full partnership of the executive branch in what will be, difficult reforms as Sally mentioned and Alex, these companies have enormous incentive to try to maintain the status quo. They have billions and billions and billions of incentives to try to prevent any reform to bring real competition into this space because they're benefiting with kind of the most profits recorded in history by this current system. And so they're going to fight hard against any of these reforms, but they're necessary to protect our democracy, to protect our economy, to protect innovation. And so this is a fight worth having, but the groups that are on this call are going to be critical in making the case to the American people about why this is so important.
much. Let me ask a question from Lauren Feiner at CNBC. She asks, you mentioned that you are beginning to draft legislation. Can you share any insight into the first topics that you'll be prioritizing when it comes to writing new bills and why?
Well, I mean, that will be a collective decision of the subcommittee members. Knowing my colleagues, my guess is, like me, there are members that are already looking at these recommendations and starting to kind of think about their own bills. I think there's a lot of excitement on both sides of the aisle about moving forward with specific legislative proposals. Some, obviously, I think will be easier to do. They're less complicated. Some will require more study and more kind of legislative drafting and more thought. But, I expect that there will be legislation introduced, some at the, in the current Congress, and for sure a whole body of bills that I expect to be introduced early in the next Congress.
Let me ask one or two more quick questions if I can.
Sure.
One of the things that we see as the economy continues its downward spiral is that these underlying questions of fair and competitive markets are going to be part and parcel with structuring economic recovery that doesn't just restore a status quo that kind of embedded a lot of these inequities of market power, but adjusts it, right, so that we fix those problems at the same time that we pursue an economic recovery from the coronavirus. How do you think about the report in the context of that kind of political fight, which right now feels like it's in a little bit of a separate lane?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question about kind of how do we quickly provide economic relief to families and small businesses that are confronting this horrible pandemic and the economic devastation that resulted from it, and getting a handle on that virus and defeating it is obviously our first priority. But I think as we think more about additional investments in economic recovery, as the Vice President has used the term building back better, but the idea of like not just recreating a failed kind of broken system in which we had this tremendous market dominance of these large platforms and grotesque income inequality and growing. So I think it's an opportunity to really inform kind of our long-term economic planning and the kind of decisions we make about what we spend money on and how we structure both our tax code and our regulatory framework in a way that promotes competition in the digital marketplace. And so it's sort of a great moment in a lot of ways to be moving forward with the recommendations in this report, because we're going to have to make some big decisions about how do we get this economy going again and get, and rebuild the economy and rebuild the workforce. And I think doing that in a way that is informed by what we found in this report will be critical, so we're not making the mistake of just simply rebuilding a system which, incentivizes or permits this tremendous kind of monopoly power of these large technology platforms.
Thanks so much. Last question, I think. How do you respond to Google, Facebook, Amazon, kind of the talking points that this is fringe, or the resurgence and revitalization of antitrust is just kind of politicized and sort of political theater and not grounded in any sort of substance or real kind of problem within the American economy? What's your response to that effort to say, oh, this is just politicization and weaponization of antitrust in ways that are unacceptable and problematic?
Well, I mean, it's a silly claim. I mean, Congress has frankly not done its job for a very long time in asserting its role in oversight of antitrust in this country. We've allowed the courts to significantly narrow antitrust enforcement, and we've allowed these companies and these platforms to basically do whatever they want without any significant oversight. And as a result of it, we have dramatically undermined innovation and competition and consumer choice, and visited a whole range of harms relating to consumer privacy and control over consumer data by individuals. And so we're beginning to see and fully understand the consequences of this failure to sort of fulfill our responsibility. Congress has the responsibility to enact competition policy to make sure it's working properly. We have kind of the worst income inequality we've had in this country since the 1920s, where we see so much of the economic growth and increase in income happening at the very top while workers continue to see wages stagnant. This is a centerpiece, I think, of the challenge that we face right now as a country is an economy that doesn't work for most people. And of course, it's been even made more difficult by COVID-19 and the economic implications of that. But even before COVID, there was a sense of these sort of mega mergers, tremendous concentration of economic power, hurting consumers and workers and wages. And we heard, of course, during the course of the investigation, significantly hurting innovation and the ability of new entrepreneurs to develop new products and be successful in creating new companies. So there's nothing fringe about that. Competition policy, which is as old as the country, was a recognition that we benefit from competition as a society. There are more choices, there's better quality, there are more options for consumers, there's better pricing. All of that comes about because you have good, fierce competition. The absence of competition means all of those things go away to some degree, and we're seeing the implications of that. So what I think is pretty fringe, as Sally has said, is the acceptance of this incredibly market dominance of these large technology platforms with virtually no restraint on it at all. That's really fringe, and it's causing real harm to consumers and to our economy, and particularly to innovators. I mean, one of the things that we learned in the course of this investigation is the decline in capital formation because people are wary about doing anything that will touch a space that these platforms already do because they know it'll get gobbled up early and there's no opportunity to really grow, create a company and really grow it. That's very problematic for the long-term, growth of our economy. So, I mean, the idea of letting these monopolies exist unconstrained by any law or oversight or effort to promote competition is actually fringe. Bringing good competition policy back is sort of as true blue as America as there is. And Congress has a responsibility to do that, and we intend to do it by way of a set of legislative proposals that will once and for all bring competition back into the digital marketplace.
Thank you so much. Well, again, let me echo everyone on this call. Congratulating you, your colleagues on the subcommittee, your staff in really a historic achievement and a playbook for how we actually solve this problem, both in terms of addressing monopolization in the tech sector and dealing with monopolization as a systemic feature of our economy today. So grateful for your time, your leadership.
Thank you.
And we're standing by for next steps.
Thank you.
For folks on the call, we are happy to answer questions as a community. We also have a couple other folks who are with us, Sabeel Rahman from Demos, Sandeep Faheezan from Open Markets, and Marshall Steinbaum from University of Utah. So if there are additional questions for any of us or for the other experts on the call, feel free to toss them in the chat. I'll check in and we can have a little conversation. I'll give it a couple minutes. There are a few questions in here for Congressman Cicilline that we did not have time to get to. Well, let me tee up a quick question for folks who are still on the line. Dania, is that all right? Great. I would love to go back to Mike Massey, if I could call on him. Are you still there, Mike?
Yep.
I think, we all really value hearing the perspective of workers, of people who are running businesses, and getting kind of bullied or exploited by these platforms. So I think I personally, and I think everyone else on this call would appreciate a little bit more context into how Amazon, what tools and levers it used to kind of put itself in a position of power over your business over time, and then how that we can kind of think about that in the context of the reforms that the subcommittee published yesterday.
So as a small retailer, let's say I have a brand, for example, and and I decide that I want to sell that brand on Amazon. The next thing I know, I'm prioritized. I'm seeing revenue and transactions coming from the platform, and and I build a business around that. I start stocking inventory, do all the, jump through all the various hoops that, make that work for me. And then after a year or so of helping develop that business, what I really find out is that, Amazon has sent their reps or, their managers directly to that manufacturer, or that vendor, or that brand to, to try to see if that brand will deal with them directly and cut me out of the picture. And this was happening over and over and over again. And it wasn't just a question of like, oh, will you sell directly to us, which is a normal, somewhat competitive experience, but, they went in there with information that I could never have. And then they made it into a, bitter pill to swallow. If the manufacturer wouldn't play along, that manufacturer would find their products no longer being displayed on the main page of the, search. There was just a lot of different ways that Amazon had to, to use the stick against people who didn't want to play along. One of our suppliers, is a bicycle parts manufacturer, and and after a few years of basically saying no, we don't want to work directly with you, Amazon went directly to their factory, made exact duplicates of their products, and started selling those. Amazingly, despite what Amazon insists is a fair algorithm, the products that had never been sold on the platform before now were suddenly showing up under that brand's searches. They were the #1 product in that bike space. And suddenly they had 1,000 reviews saying that was the best product that ever existed in the world. And that manufacturer, lost a lot of business from that. We had another manufacturer who, who felt glee that they grew their business to 80% on Amazon. And then Amazon basically went to them up in Seattle and said, this is now what you're going to be paying to us to support your brand on the platform for marketing. And that number was greater than their annual profits. So, I feel as though, when one company is able to tip the table to themselves and continue to operate, without any regard for anybody, and use market dominance that they've created, that it doesn't leave much for smaller businesses. And the really important thing I want to say before I jump off is that, I run a small business. I employ 50 people, and and I'm also a consumer. I'm out spending money at hundreds of other businesses. And it's really difficult to make sure that we invest in our local economy, when we have a predatory firm with unlimited resources, trying to disrupt our business day after day. That's it. That's all I have.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's actually one we talk about a lot in context of antitrust law, that it's oriented around this kind of notion of the consumer that tends to exclude all of the other ways that people interact with the economy as a small business person, as a worker, as an entrepreneur, as a citizen, in relation to the economic and political power of these sorts of monopolies. Let me ask another question. I think this one is probably a softball for Sally. From Julie at AFP, she says, how do you answer to Amazon when the company says that it represents only 1% and 4% of global and American retail respectively, and that the proposals would push third-party vendors out of the platform, meaning less visibility and higher prices?
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, so the 1%, 4% figures that Amazon often touts for saying that it doesn't have monopoly power are just completely irrelevant for antitrust purposes in determining whether a company has monopoly power. So monopoly power is defined as the power to control prices or exclude competition. We see direct evidence of that, extensive direct evidence of that in the House report. I've personally been covering it as well. For years, there's abundant evidence of that monopoly power. Looking at market shares is actually the way that you determine market power through indirect evidence. And indirect evidence is always less preferable to direct evidence in legal theory. Unfortunately, the courts sometimes still do require a market definition, even when that direct evidence is available. But these market definitions of all retail are just completely irrelevant, not what we would make the relevant product market for antitrust purposes. When you're defining the relevant product market, you look at substitutability. You look at if a hypothetical monopolist is able to raise prices or decrease quality a small but significant amount, what are the substitutes that consumers or third-party marketplace sellers go to in massive numbers to enough what are the substitutes that people can go to in large enough quantity that they actually constrain the monopolists from being able to raise prices or reduce quality? So it's called the hypothetical monopolist test. Don't want to get wonky, but basically, you look at the harms and you determine what are the substitutes available. And there's no way that all retail is a substitute for Amazon. So if Amazon raises its prices on, say, golf equipment, the beauty store down the street is not a substitute, okay? So it's just a completely irrelevant figure. I hope that answers that question. And in terms of, would it force them off the platform? I don't understand this argument that it would force, I just don't understand how these regulations would force third-party sellers off of the platform. I don't even understand what that means. Sorry.
Segal, hi, nice to see you. I think we all watched your testimony last week. It was really phenomenal. And I just want to give you a minute to talk about the big picture, kind of high level connection between monopoly power at these kind of extreme levels and a healthy, sustainable, inclusive democracy and the components of that. Would you mind just taking a few minutes to kind of unpack that and those linkages? And I think, just seeing all the different kinds of voices here on this call kind of demonstrate that connection and how this is upstream from so many of the social challenges that we've thought about for a long time, I think, in isolation and disconnected from policymakers' role in constraining corporate power and structuring markets. But, just paint that picture for us, if you would.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone, all the speakers, and Athena for all this great work, and of course the chairman of the subcommittee. Just to dig into that question a little bit, we have the chairman talked about how anti-monopoly policy and competition policy has been central to the American project for a long time, right? And that's true not just in economic sense, but also in the political sense. So at the hearings last week, for folks who watched, Zephyr Teachout actually talked a lot about this as well, right? She talked about how one of the real dangers of our concentrated economy is that we are effectively living under the private government, but it is private government of Amazon, of Facebook, of offline monopolists as well, and where these companies and the people who run these companies are making decisions that are literally life or death decisions for workers, for communities, for businesses, and have such enormous wealth and influence that they're able to parlay that into political influence as well, right? Throwing their weight around to get what they want from city governments, state governments, and influencing our political process at the same time. So the problem of economic power, concentrated economic power, is also a problem for democracy. That's the kind of the broad framework. I think there are also specific connections too. So if you think back just to what Rashad Robinson was talking about Facebook a few moments ago, right? So much of our public sphere now, our democratic conversation, happens on online platforms like Facebook, and the way in which Facebook controls the flow of information actually has a huge impact on the nature of our politics and our ability to even have an inclusive democracy. The last thing I'll just mention too is really connecting this to the moment we're living in terms of our deep debate about how we build an anti-racist and racially inclusive society, right? Everything we're talking about today is intimately connected to the problems of an extractive economy that is built on extraction of wealth from Black and Brown communities, impacting Black and Brown workers, and weaponizing the kind of racism online that Rashad talked about. So you said upstream, Sarah. I think the bottom line I want folks to take away is anti-monopoly policy is one of those root policy interventions and policy debates that lies underneath so many of the problems that we're facing right now in our democracy. And that's part of what makes this report so critical.
Thanks so much, Segal. Let me ask one other question. I'm not sure if we have time for more after that, but if there's still a lot of folks on this call, so throw in your questions if you have them. And this can be for Sandeep and Marshall. and then maybe we can bring Dani back into it too. But Sandeep, on a call we had before the subcommittee report came out with a bunch of the groups here today, you talked about worker power and the way that kind of unionization within firms is one way to advance worker power. And then anti-monopoly outside within the market is a complementary and essential way to structure markets so that that power internally can be distributed more easily and justly. Can you chat a little bit about that? And I'm curious how that resonates with folks who are working, at Amazon, currently and experiencing and living this imbalance, this unbalanced power dynamic.
Sure. So, thanks to our antitrust policy since the 1970s, we have a system where, on the one hand, corporate power is extremely concentrated and in the hands of a relatively small number of people in the economy, embodied by Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and others. And on the other hand, workers and small firms are fragmented, don't get to wield any collective power thanks to changes in labor law during the same time. So we have hyper-concentrated capital facing atomized labor. And we know who wins that struggle, who has the advantage in that bargain. And so antitrust and anti-monopoly sort of bring these two pieces together. It's not about promoting competition indiscriminately. It's about putting real checks and dispersing the power of capital, corporations, and allowing everyone else in the economy, consumers, workers, small firms, to come together and exercise collective power. So these are really complementary tools. And right now we have a situation where capital can wield its might and doesn't really face any resistance to that. And an anti-monopoly program would ultimately transfer power out of the hands of Jeff Bezos, out of the hands of Mark Zuckerberg, out of the hands of shareholders, and into the hands of all the millions of producers in the economy, whether they're workers or small businesses. So we shouldn't really view antitrust and unionization as sort of an either or. We should really view it as a both and. And if we want to create a fair democratic economy, both policy tools are essential.
Thanks so much. William or Dani, do you want to talk about that from your own experience at Amazon?
Sure. At different points in us trying to organize for better working conditions at our Amazon warehouse in Minnesota, and it hasn't been a unionization campaign, but different issues through these last few years, as far as just like fair disciplining systems, fair workloads, better like health and safety. There's been, a lot of the times when we've been able to make significant changes just on the floor in our warehouse has been when, like, at the same time, there's been some other kind of movement on the outside emphasizing a lot of the same issues. So at the end of 2019, we're making a big push for reinvigorating the health and safety committees. Many of them had just been dormant at Amazon. So there's this part of, I don't know if it's in all states, but there's this part of OSHA law in Minnesota where every employer over 25 employees has to have a joint labor management health safety committee. And one of the reasons that our internal pressure in the warehouse was able to be successful in winning that and helping us make those committees into things that were powerful, at least until coronavirus kind of shut down any kind of big gathering, was the incredible health and safety reporting coming out of Reveal at the time, documenting Amazon's high injury rates. And so those things working together, also just, there are other examples of that happening at different points in in our campaign, where you know, like kind of just different people in like different universes of wanting Amazon to do the right thing can help, have been able to help us kind of like secure important victories just at the warehouse level. So, you know, any pressure that can come from any direction is pretty welcome from my perspective as a worker, just because so often they're just used to operating without any kind of accountability, or just not having to worry that much about any kind of criticism.
Much. Dania, do you want to add any additional thoughts to that? We still have you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll add something briefly. You know, I think like for us, it is extremely important in this region, right, to be in this fight. And along with Athena, of course, but also really glad to be in this fight or against big tech with freedom from Facebook and Google and American Family Voices, right? Because, for example, here, this area, and there's an area in Virginia that's called Data Valley, right? Data Alley, excuse me. And so we know that that a lot of people in power, a lot of politicians here have a desire to make this area what they call the Silicon Valley of the East, right? And so it is just not a fight. Like Amazon is our most direct immediate threat here, but it is a fight against these corporations overall, right? And as far as sort of the role of monopoly and how the fight to breaking up, how that plays out here locally, I'm gonna focus a little bit just like on decision making, right? Literally right before this call, I saw an article that Amazon has donated, I believe, $1 million to Arlington County Public Schools to try to support for whatever is happening with a lot of kids having challenges with access to internet, et cetera. But we also know that Arlington County has also promised Amazon a $51 million set of incentives, right? And that Virginia as a state have also promised Amazon $750 million in tax breaks. So $1 million is a drop in the bucket compared to what they're planning to get in the long term. And also really thinking about what if it was these families, Black and brown families in particular, immigrant families, people who are low income and poor, what if they were the ones deciding what to do with publicly generated funds, as opposed to having a corporation that as soon as they put out this measly amount, they have a PR machine behind them saying, look at all this grand stuff that we're doing, when in reality, it's our folks who have been dealing with the brunt of the pandemic in extreme ways, right? People who have been waiting for months and months and months to receive assistance from the county in being able to pay the rent. Now they have been waiting because there seems that there isn't enough funds. There might not be enough people on staff to be able to assist people properly. And so what if we could really have publicly generated funds determined and decided by the people, as opposed by corporations or by a single individual like Jeff Bezos, right? And so like this is just one example of how it's playing out here in our communities, and not really like thinking about the overwhelming influence they have on our elected officials. And so it's really important for us to continue to organize and build community power so that we as people can determine our own future.
Thanks so much. So I think with that, we'll wrap it up, just to, I think, emphasize where we're at and take a step up. You know, I think just a few years ago, it would have been almost unthinkable for Congress to produce a report like the one that came out yesterday, a kind of detailed evisceration of the business practices and strategy of monopolization of the most powerful corporations in the world, a set of recommendations that include deep structural reforms that these corporations vehemently oppose, and the deployment of millions and millions and millions of dollars to resist that, not only through direct lobbying efforts, but through tactics like what Dani just described, trying to embed themselves in communities in ways that perpetuate their power over communities, small businesses, workers, and our democracy on the whole. So we see a fight teed up in Congress over legislation. We see opportunities, obviously, potentially coming out of the White House and a executive branch that is likely under Trump to pursue cases against some of these platforms very soon, and hopefully if there is a change of administration, a far more robust approach to enforcement than either the Obama or certainly the Trump era. And then we see activity happening all over the country at the state and local level, undergirded by folks like Athena and the coalitions that they have pulled together of workers and small businesses, and a real growing network and infrastructure that just did not exist a handful of years ago to continue to push this fight forward. So thanks for everyone for joining today. Thanks for the good questions. Thanks for all the experts and workers and small business people who have been a part of this fight and aren't on this call. I think it's a moment to really sit down and read 449 pages of this report, take it in, and then sit back and strategize for the coming weeks, months, and years of a fight that's going to last quite a long time, but that I'm certainly confident that we will, in the end, win. Thanks so much.